Hello everyone, and welcome to Flow Fundamentals from the Automating Admin, the video series designed to help Salesforce professionals learn flows. In today's video, we are wrapping up the exploration of flow elements by checking out the screen element. We'll go over how to build out a screen element, as well as using data from the screen to perform other actions in the flow. By the end of this video, we'll learn how to build and configure a screen in a ScreenFlow, the differences between commonly used screen components, how to use the screen component values in the flow. As we mentioned in our previous video, the screen element is unique to ScreenFlows. Screens allow the end user to interact with the flow directly, either by viewing data and information placed on the screen, or by setting and updating fields. We can take the data the user provided and use it to create or update records. We can also use the data entered in a screen to drive decisions later on in the flow. To get started, add the screen element to the flow. This will open the screen editor window. On the left-hand side is a components list, which we can use to add various types of components to the screen. The fields list allows us to add object-specific fields using a source record variable which will store the values. We'll discuss that more later. In the middle is the preview window, which shows us the screen's header, footer, and all components added to the screen. On the right-hand side is the properties section, which will have different options depending on what we are configuring on the screen. We can also expand the properties section for better visibility if need be. When starting with a new screen, we are asked to enter in the screen properties. Screen properties are where we set the screen's name, API, and description. We also have options for how to configure the screen's header and footer. For the header, we can choose to show or hide the header, which is the flow's name, as well as optionally provide help text. The footer determines which buttons are present. We can choose to show a button, hide a button, or use a custom label. The Next or Finish button navigates the user to the next screen in the flow, or, if the user is at the final screen, ends the flow. The Previous button allows the user to go back to the last screen visited. The Pause option allows a user to suspend the current flow and come back to it later. However, this setting needs to be enabled in the org for users to take advantage of it. A newer feature of ScreenFlows is the ability to add screen actions. These actions trigger auto-launched flows that users can trigger via buttons on the footer. To do this, click Add Action, select your auto-launched flow, and then enter the necessary data, inputs, and outputs. If we need to get back to the screen properties after we've begun adding components, simply click on the header, footer, or any empty space in the current screen. After we have configured our screen properties, it is now time to build out the screen. To do this, we will need to add components or fields to the screen. Let's start with components. Components allow a user to view, interact, and take action on data while inside a screen. Components can be made up of fields, display items, and even actions or custom-built solutions. To add a component, either click and drag the component onto the screen, or simply click it to add it below any existing components. Once added, configure the necessary properties for the component, such as its label, API, and more. We can click and drag an existing component to move it, or click the trash can icon to delete it. There are many components we can add, and some are specific to certain purchased products and installed packages. In this video, we'll focus on a handful of the more common components, as well as the components that require a bit more configuration. We'll also touch on some of the common properties as we encounter them. The set component visibility and other properties listed below the main component's properties will appear for almost every component, so we will discuss those in a few moments. The display text component allows a user to create rich text to display on the screen. The section component can be used to create up to 4 columns on the screen, which can then be used to better display other components. To add another column, click the Add Column button. We can also set the width of each column, but if we leave the value as is, then all columns will be of equal width. The text and text area allow a user to enter in text. The required checkbox means the user must have a value entered before proceeding. We can use true or false to set the read-only and disabled options. Both read-only and disabled prevents the user from setting or changing the values, but depending on the option selected will have different backgrounds. Here is an example of two text fields, one set to read-only and one set to disabled. Finally, we can set a default value, so when the user navigates to this screen, there is already data present. Number, currency, date, and date time components behave similarly to text. However, they have an additional option specific for their field type formats, such as a decimal place for number and a date format for date. The checkbox and the toggle components are both Boolean components. The checkbox has minimal configurations. However, with toggles, we can set the label value for when it is active or inactive. The value is the Boolean portion of the component, where false is inactive and true is active. The Picklist, multi-select Picklist, checkbox group, and radio buttons all allow a user to select one or multiple choices. The Configure Choices section allows us to quickly change to a different type of choice component, such as switching from a Picklist to a multi-select Picklist. For these components to properly function, we need to assign one or more choice resources. As discussed in our previous Flow Resources video, we can create single choices, Picklist choice sets from an existing Picklist field, collection choice sets from a collection variable, or record choice sets from a collection of records. Address and name are multi-field components because multiple values can be set with a single component, such as an address's street, city, and state. We can set default values for these components and even add more parameters, such as Google Maps integrations for address and middle name for the name. The lookup component allows us to add a lookup field to the screen. This one can be tricky, so let's go through each property setting. API name is the API for the screen component specifically. Field API name is the API of the field when viewing in Object Manager. The label is the screen component's label that will be shown to the user. Object API name is the API of the object where the lookup field exists. This can also be found in Object Manager. Maximum selections determine how many records a user can select. The default value is 1. Record ID and Record ID collection is equivalent to a default value, providing the user with pre-populated information. Finally, required means it is a required field. Before moving on to the field section, let's take a look at the other properties for a given component. The Set Component Visibility allows us to set parameters for when a component is shown or hidden, similar to conditional visibility on a Lightning page. We can set complex logic for the visibility if need be. The Validate Input property checks to see if a formula evaluates to true, and if it returns false, displays an error on the field when the user tries to proceed to the next screen. Think of this like a reverse validation rule. Here is an example of a text field where it checks if the user entered the value 123 in the text box. If they type anything else and try to click Next, they will receive an error. If they type 123 exactly, then they can proceed without issue. Provide Help will give the component a tooltip bubble next to the component label, similar to tooltip bubbles on regular fields in Salesforce. Finally, Advanced determines how values are treated if the user sets a value and then has to revisit the screen later on, such as clicking Previous. We can keep the values as is or clear out the values. If we have a record variable in our flow, we can use that to add fields to a screen component. To do this, select the necessary record variable, and then add the fields the same way we would add components. The values entered or changed by the user will automatically be set on the assigned record variable when the flow navigates to the next step, reducing the need for assignment actions. While the record variable field has its benefits, there are some drawbacks. First, not every type of field is available for use, such as currency fields. Additionally, we can't set the field to required or read-only, as those options are driven by the user's permission to that object and field. We also cannot validate input on these fields or change the help text. After we have built out our screen, we can use the dataset to drive decisions and even create or update records. For decision elements, we can simply select screen components as resources for criteria checking, such as if a checkbox was marked true or a field was populated. Additionally, we can select the screen element itself and then choose the Was Visited operator to determine how to proceed if a screen was or wasn't visited in the flow. For setting, creating, and updating records, the process is similar. Configure the necessary element, such as an assignment element, and then select your screen components as the value. As a reminder, any fields used from a record variable have already been set, so we do not need to create an element for assigning the new values. That's all for today's Flow Fundamentals video. If you enjoyed the topic, please be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks, and I'll see y'all later.